Coffee Branch Preacher. Jean and I were greenhorns when our leader sent us to where we'd be completely on our own. Before we left, an older missionary gave me some advice. As soon as you get there, he said, find out where the local churches are and let people know that you'd like to visit a different one each week. Don't go to the same one twice until you've been to all the others. Ask God to give you the one message that will be most helpful for the Christians in that area and deliver it every Sunday to every church you visit. At first it'll be hard work and you'll only be able to give a short sermon. But if you prepare diligently, you can add a few sentences each time. The Gedio tribal church around Yirgacheffe was young and growing fast. 15 fellowships had already been planted and 1 or 2 new ones sprang up each month, which meant that I could go quite a few Sundays on rotation before hitting the same church twice. Ethiopians sort their rugged, diverse land into 3 broad categories by elevation. Most people consider the Midlands at 6,000 to 8,000 feet, called Wenidaga, to be just right, temperate, lush and excellent for growing most crops, neither too high nor too low. Yirgacheffe sits in this fertile mid-zone, blessed by abundant rainfall, overblessed in fact. Although the landscape is green and beautiful, the earth is sodden year-round, so much so that even the town's name is a kind of prayer or plea meaning, let the swamp solidify. But the climate affords one great benefit. It's ideal for coffee growing. The first thing to strike me when we came over the mountain pass into Gedio territory was the coffee trees. Thousands and thousands of them, acre upon acre, grove upon grove. The dark soil around Yirgacheffe nourishes some of the most prized beans in the world, and today you can find them in premier coffee shops everywhere. After we arrived, local farmers told me that because the area was so rich in rain, well-fertilized trees could flower and yield up to 7 crops in a single year. Coffee was evidently the local priority. My older colleagues' words echoed in my mind. Ask God to give you a message that will be most helpful for the Christians in that area. A sermon was taking shape. Ethiopian legend has it that a goatherd first discovered the miraculous properties of coffee. He noticed that when his flock browsed a certain kind of wild bush, they become less troublesome and aggressive. Curious, he snapped up a sprig of leaves and boiled them in water, serving the drink to his family. When he observed the enlivening effects and the change in mood, he was intrigued. He decided to experiment on his friends as well, brewing both the leaves and the glossy red fruit. The results were marvellous. Each person became more animated, more good-natured, eyes brightened, conversation flowed. He'd stumbled upon a wondrous elixir. Coffee, which grows abundantly in the well-watered hills of the south, is an integral part of Ethiopian life. The traditional coffee serving ceremony is rightly famous. When you are invited to someone's home to chat over a cup or 3, know that it will be longer, more elaborate, more sacred affair than the utilitarian Starbucks rendezvous of urban Western culture. It will take an hour to prepare the first cup. Your hostess begins with the raw materials, coffee cherries plucked from the tree. She cuts them open, revealing 2 small beans inside of each, which she roasts in a shallow metal dish set on stones over an open fire. The woman takes her time with the roasting, stirring the beans continually with a long curved bamboo stick. She monitors the beans as they brown, making sure the scent and hue are perfect. The aroma fills the house. When the beans are a rich dark colour, your hostess reaches into the dish with her bare fingers and an impressive display of heat resistance picks the husks of each individual bean. Then she pours the contents of the roasting dish into a wooden mortar, crushing them with a well-worn pestle. While she diligently beats the beans to powder, she or another woman brings water to a boil in a traditional coffee pot, a jabana. The jabana is ornate. Line and ring carvings grace its burnished clay exterior, and its rounded body narrows to a long, slender neck, whose opening can be plugged with a corncob to hold in the fragrance once the grounds are added. Below this upper vent, just a short, elegantly curved spout. When the water is boiling and any remaining fragments of bean have been pulverized, your hostess takes a cowhorn spoon, measures out the coffee grounds according to the number of drinkers, and deposits them into the jubana through the narrow mouth at the top. She wedges in the corncob plug and lets the coffee brew slowly, judging perfection by the volume of steam rising from the spout. Once she is satisfied that the coffee is ready, she pours it carefully into little handleless cups arranged on a low wooden table, which she will then lift like a serving tray and bring around to each guest in succession. The pouring is a delicate process, but there's no filter or mush on the spout, so the woman must fill each cup slowly so that as few of the grounds as possible escape the jubana, leaving enough in the pot to pour fresh water over for a second and even a third brewing. Foreigners say that the first cup is too strong, the third too weak, and the second just right. For Ethiopians, no coffee is too strong, so they add flavour with a red chili pepper or rancid butter. The latter floats on the surface like a monochrome oil slick, forcing the reluctant traveller to brave the greasy skin to get to the more desirable depths. In ceremonies staged for tourists, sugar is gracefully substituted to cater to foreign tastes. The rancid butter is certainly an acquired taste and one that I'm grateful for. Over the years it has allowed me to appropriate the cups of numerous companions who couldn't get past the off-smelling top layer. Of course, what I've described is the ideal coffee experience for Westerners, who only know the power of the bean itself. Outside the coffee-going hills and the homes of wealthy Ethiopians, people harness the cheaper parts of the plant, the leaves and skin, for the vitalizing potential, and coffee drinking in these regions is less ritualized. Hosts will ladle a beverage out of a large pot into ancient half-gourds that have never once been scrubbed clean. Foreigners are often revolted the first time they peer into their gourd. Not only is it blackened from countless coffee drinking sessions, but the hardened residue has taken on the appearance of thick, crusted scabs. Thankfully, a scalding ladleful of coffee sterilizes the gourd, making it safe to drink from. Poor highland dwellers boil the leaves of the tree, while nomads in the lowlands relish the brew from the coffee cherry's dried outer skin, called bunagalaba. Both parts are more caffeine-laced than the bean, yet coffee growers have little use for them. Years after our stay in Yirgacheffe, when I discovered that nomads had a penchant for bunagalaba and that the farmers could discard it anyway, I tied 6 or 7 sacks of the lightweight skins onto the roof of my Land Rover and passed them out to the Ethiopian evangelists who were living amongst the lowland peoples. Suddenly, the evangelists had an audience. Nomadic neighbours flocked to their homes to hear about Jesus and get a powerful caffeine rush. God knows how to draw a crowd. What message would be more fitting for people whose life revolved around coffee production? I decided to preach on John 15, where Jesus tells us how to bear fruit and more fruit. Although my Harrick was still halting, I could read the Bible quite well, so I tried to compensate for my limited expository vocabulary by filling my sermon with plenty of scripture. I also decided to bring along coffee branches in a brown paper bag for the sake of illustration, and as a visual crutch to support my feeble attempts at preaching in another language. The first branch had many leaves but no fruit. The second had much fruit and few leaves, and the third was a dried, withered branch that the farmer had cut from the tree. I stood up to deliver my first message at a Gedeo church, pulling the branches out of the bag one by one as I expounded the passage. The congregation listened politely while I told through my brief, painstaking rehearsed sermon in Amharic. My interpreter gave a lackluster rendering into Gedeo, deadpan, and apparently none of the elaboration I had hoped for. The whole thing was stunningly short. I said a concise prayer and sat down. Even with translation, the preaching couldn't have lasted more than 7 minutes. The elders seemed unfazed and led the congregation a song. When it was over, the senior pastor turned to me warmly. "We're ready to hear the rest of your teaching. Please continue." "I'm sorry," I replied, "but that's all the Amharic I know at this time." Not missing a beat, the pastor turned to the congregation to rescue me from my embarrassment. "This is our missionary's first time preaching in our church. We'll invite him back next year to hear the rest of his teaching on the coffee branches." Then, as if reenacting Elisha's miracle with the oil, he stretched my meagre exposition into a 30-minute homily. This was all the more impressive when I considered that he could barely read the Amharic Bible. I laboured each week to add new sentences to my existing coffee branch sermon, but the length varied greatly depending on the kind of interpreter I had on a given Sunday. I tried to find imaginative men of many words, who would pad the preaching with their own colourful asides and applications. I prayed for godly loquacious interpreters. The second week my sermon lasted 10 minutes, in the hands of a master embellisher. The third 11 with the more laconic fellow who could only eke out a few additional points. Of course, I didn't know what they were saying since I couldn't understand Gedeo, but I hoped the amplification was inspired. As my preaching steadily improved, I started getting invitations to more remote churches, sometimes far enough away that I'd have to leave home on a Saturday to arrive in time for next morning's service. Over time, I learned which of the local evangelists were most verbose and invited them alongside to translate. The rate at which new churches were sprouting across the verdant hillsides and valleys of Gedeo country meant that I could have gone on like this indefinitely, speaking to a different fellowship every Sunday, pulling coffee branches out of the same brown paper bag, reading from the same chapter over and over. After a year, my sermon extended to 25 minutes with good interpretation, but by that point I was tired of it and ready to move on to other teachings. 7 or 8 years later, long after Jean and I had left Yirgacheffe, Gedeo church leaders invited me back to speak at their annual conference. The conference grounds were teeming with people. Several thousand had come out for a few days of worship and teaching. On the last day, a Sunday, I was one of the appointed speakers. I took to the podium and gave my address. I've long since forgotten what I preached about that day, but I had advanced in my Amharic enough by then that the sermon was at least of a respectable length. I concluded it and took my seat. The Gedeo man beside me stood up to deliver the final message of the conference. To my amazement, he was holding a brown paper bag. He needed no interpreter, being a native son, and he was evidently a sensational orator. The crowd sat spellbound as he warmed up with a lengthy introduction, and then pulled each coffee branch out of the bag in turn, speaking for the next hour or so at high speed and volume. He fired questions at the crowd, brandishing the coffee branches. The crowd roared back answers in unison, as if they knew this routine by heart and loved it. I too was mesmerized. All I could think of were my faltering efforts to illuminate the same teaching years before. This was transformation. My beginner's sermon had grown by an order of magnitude. The preacher reached the climax of his message with a final rhetorical flourish. The crowd thundered his appreciation, and he took his seat beside me. As the singing and offering time began around us, I leaned over and spoke in Amharic. That must have been a great message. The people obviously enjoyed it. They seem to know how to answer all your questions. Oh, yes, he replied with a smile. This is the preacher the Gedeo Christians like best. Every year they invite the most popular preacher to give it, and they want to hear it again and again. Why is that? Well, it teaches us how to bear fruit spiritually, but it also taught us how to produce more coffee. You see, the government agriculture people had been saying for years that we should prune our coffee trees if we wanted a greater yield. But that always sounded like foolishness. How could cutting off branches produce more fruit? But when we Christians heard Jesus say, Every branch in me that bears fruit, God prunes it so it will bear more fruit. We took note and started cutting. Not so foolish after all. Within 3 years, our trees were producing twice as much coffee as the unbelievers. By the time they learned the secret of our success, we were already much wealthier than them. Not only that, but because we didn't waste our money on gambling, drinking and prostitutes, we were able to buy up the land of men who'd driven themselves into debt through sinful living. Thank God for sowing my pitiful sermon into good soil. For the Gideon farmers who took Jesus at his word, the word yielded much more than 100-fold. Treating John 15 as a grower's manual had never even crossed my mind. But the Lord knew what a coffee-loving people needed to hear, and he didn't separate his spiritual blessings from his physical ones. If this kind of blessing makes us nervous, we should remember that God also multiplied Abraham's herds and flocks so that his life would be a testament to divine goodness. And the writer of Psalm 67 connects witness to a bountiful harvest. That's our God. He can multiply the fruit of the coffee tree, even as he produces fruit in those who tend it.